Welcome everybody to part 2 of 4. I hope you enjoyed part 1. Please reach out to me, give me your feedback. If you have any questions, just know I'm here to support you. So consciously manifesting your life, there is like a system you can use. There are some clues on how to do it. And on part 1, we kind of gave you an overview of the system and gave you some really important tips and some reasons why you can manifest and why you may not be manifesting. And then one of the things we talked about is the brain and body system. So that's what we're going to really focus on today. What are the parts of the brain that prevent or support manifestation? And the emotions that the brain delivers, how can they help or detract from manifestation? And which emotions are better at manifesting than other emotions? I think that's important. And as part of that brain system, we're going to talk about implicit and explicit learning and procedural memory, because the subconscious is really what either holds us back or springs us forward, and that is held in that implicit learning and procedural memory. And then we're going to end with some skills and steps and spiritual universal laws that you can follow to really manifest your life by changing your brain and body systems. In part 4, we'll talk more about the energetics of change and energetics of changing the brain and body systems. But in part 2 and 3, we're looking more at the biological consciousness container. I call it the biological consciousness container because as a spiritual being, we have to work through this body and brain system. And even though manifestation energetically comes from the higher realms and comes down into the physical, as that video in part 1 showed, we have to work through this more denser physical reality to manifest and create what we want. So you learn skill 1, step 1, and spiritual law 1 in the first part, and now we're taking it deeper into the next level. And there are handouts of all the skills, steps, and spiritual laws, and also notes from this that you can find and are included for you, so you can follow along as we deal with more complex issues. Let's get started. So I thought I'd show you this video again as a reminder of part 1, that the way you run your energy and the way you respond in the world around you can mean that you're invaded or that you really control what's near you. And there's my puppy and my black lab that we talked about last time, my gray cat Sydney, that was really good at creating her reality and not letting the puppy invade her. And then my loving Gus cat, who wasn't so good at it. And here, Caribou, it can hold both. She can let herself be the good enough mom, as many moms need to let their kids really be close, but when they need to set boundaries, you can see at the end she growls and says, okay, that's enough. So learning how to do that is a lot to do with how the brain and body systems work. But first I wanted to show you this picture of a tree. I lived in Zimbabwe for a while, Africa, and this tree only blooms during a drought. It's dead during the rainy season, but it blooms during the drought. And that's a good metaphor for what you're able to accomplish. Even during the droughts in your life, you can find the steps and skills and spiritual universal laws, the ability to rewire your mind, energy, and body systems to create magic and to manifest what's best in your life. So I just wanted to start that with a really optimistic uptake as we talk more of the heady brain science of it. I really love this Abraham Hicks quote. It talks about, like, the Hicks have spent so much time talking about manifestation, and they really laid a good foundation about the emotional connection, which activates the memory of the brain and can support manifestation. or she puts it, your hands are tied in action, but your hands are not tied in imagination. And everything springs forth from imagination, everything. Yet it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'm sure you all have thought of something, imagined something, and it hasn't always arrived. And so let's talk about the brain and body systems. And again, in the fourth, we'll talk about the energetics of why it may manifest sometimes immediately and why some things don't necessarily always show up. We did cover some of that in the last session, so please feel free to review the last one, but we're going to bring it into the biology of the brain and body systems in this next piece. So let's first talk about what kind of emotion activates manifestation. So fear. I was in Cambodia, and this was during the Hun Sen coup about 20 years ago. Oh my gosh, that long ago. And I was living in Cambodia with my young kids. My kids were about 7 and 4 back then. And a coup broke out. So there were bombs around us and gunshots, and we were living in the basement. For a little bit, we had food, we had water, we felt fairly safe in the basement, staying so a stray bullet wouldn't hit my babies. But it got to a point where it got really clear that this needed to end. And so there was a part of me in fear that activated this clarity of intention. I didn't go to victim and collapse. I didn't let my mind loop. I didn't go to negative feelings. I just got really strong and clear that this needed to end. And within the hour, there was a ceasefire, and we were evacuated out of the country, taking just a backpack of clothes and things. So I feel like I was so clear that I let my clarity of intention, clarity of mind, my whole mind, energy, body, energy system was like, this has to end, and immediately happened. So on some level, fear was helpful. But fear isn't always helpful. If it brings you more into a collapsed victim consciousness, you just don't have the higher vibration to really attract what you want. So fear comes from a certain part of the brain. And we're going to talk more about that. The brain can be reactive in a way to collapse or create strength. If it's habituated to really show up in this leader energy of I'm going to make it happen, I'm not a victim, I'll jump the next hurdle and overcome, that is a good wiring of the brain. However, Rick Hanson, who has written many wonderful books, Hardwiring Happiness is one of my favorite books, talks about the caveman brain. So we are born with a caveman brain that always wants to look at the negative, because that's how we survived. If we could see the attacking animal in the grass, we would survive. If we didn't see it, we were eaten and died. And that negativity bias of the brain can lower your frequency, can make you collapse into the negative emotions of fear or negative emotions of victim, sadness, hopelessness, and will prevent you from manifesting what you want. So if you collapse into the pain, you lose a differentiation in individualization of who you really are. So in the previous talk, in the previous section, we talked about your sense of self creates your realities, spiritual law 1. And if you're vibrating at your wounded trauma self, a false self, you're going to create a lower vibrational reality than if you're connected to that core being, that bigger essence of who you really are. So you have to learn how to individualize and differentiate and detach from your brain's negative wiring in order to rewire it back to a higher vibration and to a more proactive, balanced clarity that I had when I'm like, this coup has to end. We have to have a ceasefire to get my babies out of here. That makes sense? So the brain is not the mind. The brain will go to a lower vibration. It just will. It's that caveman brain. But it's not the mind. It's not your sense of self. If your mind is vibrating at the level of your core being, your true essence, the mind can come in and rewire the brain. We're going to talk more about that. I know that's a new way of looking at it, but if you go back to the previous training of the white paint, black paint, if your brain is in black paint, but your mind is resonating at higher vibration, white paint, and it knows who it is, it's connected to its core being, it's individualized, differentiated, and detached from the negativity and the lower vibrations before them, the mind can come in, rewire the brain and body system back to a higher frequency to habituate manifestation, good manifestation, positive manifestation, instead of the negative past. A good example of this is when my daughter, she graduated from Colorado University, and she continued on to fulfill her elementary ed teacher certification. And when she graduated from that, she's like, okay, now I got to find a job. And she just got no calls. She applied to over 100 school districts and no calls, no interviews. And so she was collapsing into the negativity of that caveman brain, and her sense of self felt she was a loser and she wouldn't be able to get that great job, right? Yet she has me as her mom, so I taught her how to self-regulate. I actually taught her how to use anger and mobilization techniques and exercise to help her differentiate and individualize from the emotional pain. And every time she did one of the exercises I gave her, within an hour, she got a phone call for an interview. And after doing that 4 different times, she finally got a job offer. So yes, using mobilization, exercise to access anger and strength and change the brain with the higher frequency of the mind can help you create what you want. So let's learn more about that brain, that caveman brain. There are 3 parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which Rick Hansen calls the monkey part of the brain. It's the higher brain. It's the executive functions of the brain. It's the thinking brain. And then there's the limbic, the midbrain, the mouse brain. And then there's the primal brain, the brain stem, that is the more reptile brain, where a lot of the subconscious reactivity is held. And same with the amygdala is part of the midbrain, and a lot of the subconscious reactivity and overwhelming emotions can be burst from that part of the brain. Lower your frequency, make your sense of self think you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, you feel abandoned, whatever is your negative way of collapsing into emotions, or blame, defense, projection. It's all about them. You know, if it's all about them, you can't change them. You can only change your reality from here. So they may be doing something wrong, but how do you engage, like Sydney, my cat, engaged with the puppy to create a different outcome? So an example of a negative wiring, I had a client come in the other day, and you know, kind of everything fell apart in her life. And about a year ago, she was so rewired to collapse that she couldn't manifest what she wanted. Everything kept going wrong, but it was her habituated negative patterns that created the challenges in her marriage, the challenges in her career. because she went back to her childhood trauma where she was abused and mistreated by her mom. So, I worked with her over a period of time. The past year, she's been resonating at that white paint mind, rewiring her brain's negative patterns until things got difficult. She came in and she was in collapse. And she knew she was going to create this negative reality if she didn't find the power and strength. So I helped her find her power and strength again. She went back into her life, and all of a sudden, everything that broke, she understood her part in it, the universe's part in it, and how to rebuild. And that's what manifestation is about, how not to be collapsed and over-identified with those three parts of the brain, but to use the higher white paint mind of your true essence to reprogram the brain and body systems. So which part of the brain manifests strongest? I think when your limbic, the midbrain, the emotional part of the brain that gets reactive, and where trauma can be held or healthy emotions can be held, works in sync with the higher brain, like I did when I manifested the ceasefire in Cambodia and got my kids out of the coup. That really creates the optimal situation for manifestation. You can use healthy level of fear and anger, as my daughter and I did in that instance, to really create what you want. I find anger is one of the most useful emotions. When you learn how to feel anger in a way that actually creates a sense of empowerment, you can totally manifest from there. Now I want to talk a little bit about something called procedural memory and a client story around love. Procedural memory is more of the subconscious memory, the habituated patterns that are more reactive and motor involved. I had a wonderful student that became a teacher in my program have some trauma at a younger age around love. And he was holding on to this part of himself that said he ruined that past relationship. It was the only time he was truly in love, and he'll never be able to find that love again. And so as he moved into years beyond that, he couldn't find relationships. He always picked the wrong person. He couldn't fix his picker, and he would end up having them leave because they attacked him in a negative way, or he just couldn't bond with them. So once we did some work around that past trauma, he was able to change his sense of self, change how his brain worked around love, and find somebody that he could really fall in love with that's a healthy relationship that could meet him where he's at. And that's so important to understand the role of implicit versus explicit memory, and the role that it has in creating healthy relationship. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So there's different types of learning. Actually, I'm going to go back to this slide a little longer. There's explicit learning, like where you read a book and you learn facts. And then there's implicit learning that comes from that emotional part of the brain. For instance, my story is my dad as a kid used to attack and hurt me all the time. So I learned to collapse and numb. That is more implicit learning. Another fun example of implicit learning versus explicit learning. Again, explicit learning is like going to college and learning facts and figures and memorization. Implicit learning, an example is the movie 50 First Dates, where Adam Sandler fell in love with Drew Barrymore. and she had a brain injury and she could only remember one day at a time. But if she wanted to learn how to play the piano, which is more of a implicit learning, she could remember how to play a song on the piano, but she couldn't remember the day before. So implicit learning is more body-centered. It's more habitual. It's conditioned behavior. And what I find is that has a link to the ego, trauma, and the false self, like the story of my dear student who couldn't find love because of the past trauma until he shifted his false self, his trauma, his negative beliefs. Whereas Einstein says, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, yet expect different results, isn't that the definition of insanity? So if your subconscious is doing the same thing and you're not aware of what you're doing, that's a good reason that you're not manifesting what you want. So learning how to awaken and see what is under the surface, what's working deeper, what's stuck in your procedural memory and implicit learning that's not clearly conscious. What sort of primitive learning or response systems are in charge, negative habituated patterns where you're subconsciously reacting to stimuli in unhealthy ways. And we're going to talk more about this in the next training. But you're not going to manifest those things. And you could feel victimized by it, collapse into your false self, get overwhelmed by the hurricane of life. So I'm really hoping that, and we're going to do an exercise on this, that you can start understanding what is going on below the surface that creates those negative habituated patterns that prevents the manifestation of what is in your highest good. So like I said before, we're always manifesting. We're just not always manifesting our highest good. Wouldn't it be great to learn why? And how empowering is that? Is to learn why. For instance, Sydney has already have this implicit procedural memory to protect herself. Where Gus, the other cat, just doesn't know how to do that very well. In fact, we keep a collar on Gus so she doesn't go out of the yard. Have an electric fence so Gus doesn't go out. So Gus doesn't go out of the yard because he just can't protect himself. Where are you lost in your conditioned behavior, repeating unknown patterns that are holding you back, where you're not protecting your manifestation, where you're not supporting that to happen? That's what we're going to explore. So there's these things called trauma orienting patterns. And again, we'll talk more about this in the next training. This is a picture of Pat Ogden, who is a brain scientist, and she's one of my most favorite people. Her book, The Body, Trauma in the Body, her book called Trauma in the Body is just brilliant. And she writes in the book, long after the original event is over, many individuals find themselves compelled to anticipate, orient to, and react to stimuli that directly or indirectly resembles the original traumatic experience or its context. So again, my student that couldn't manifest love because he was trapped in the past, right? These individuals unconsciously and reflexively narrow the field of consciousness to reminders of the trauma, thereby failing to perceive cues indicative of safety and inadvertently maintaining an internal sense of threat. Again, we'll talk more about that in the next training. But Sydney didn't have a collapse, didn't have a, Sydney the cat didn't have an unhealthy orienting pattern and could shift her reality so the puppy didn't bother her. Alternately, they may experience hypo aroused related interference with the innate ability to orient to cues signaling either pleasure or danger. So if you go numb, you can't manifest pleasure. You can't find danger and take reaction. Or you basically shut down and you're unable to perceive your own emotions or body sensations and fail to notice threatening stimuli, which can result in increased vulnerability and re-victimization. So this is huge in terms of how you relate and interact with the environment outside of you, with the universe. So if the universe sends you this great sign of path for manifestation, but you're numb and frozen and hyper-aroused, you can't see it. You can't see the pleasure. You can't see the path to let that happen. So unless you learn to face your own shadows, you will continue to see them in others, because the world outside you is only a reflection of the world inside you. Again, I think Sydney and Gus are a good example of that. So let's do an exercise on manifesting. So let's look at what you tried but failed. And I have a very embarrassing story. When I was a teenager, I was so good at manifesting. I could manifest things right away. I usually wanted to manifest a boy because I was a teenager. And I would say, I want, Matt to invite me out to go steady with me. Back then, we had ID bracelets and we went steady. Or I'd want Mark or whoever I wanted, they would ask me out and ask me to go steady. But because my sense of self didn't match that frequency, because it freaked me out about my power of being able to manifest, and because even though I wanted it, I was really afraid of it because my own childhood wounding, I got in my own way. So if I had done this exercise as a kid, I would have had a great time in high school. I would have kept manifesting, and I'd probably be in a very different place right now if I hadn't sabotaged that power within. So let's look at how you might go hypo-aroused, where you shut down, or you overreact, hyper-aroused, where you overreact. So think of something that you want to manifest, but you haven't. Do you tend to shut down and not see danger and stand up for yourself like Gus? Or do you overreact and go hyper-aroused and kind of get reactive or angry and shut it down that way? And again, you can pause the tape at any time to answer these questions. Yeah. So think about it. So in my situation, I would shut down, and they would call me after they asked me to go steady. But when we'd go out on the date, I couldn't talk to them. I was just filled with shame and sadness because I didn't believe in my own life. Right? Another thing that I would do is I would trust too much. When I was in other relationships, I would be like, oh, they'll treat, like business relationships, they'll treat me right. Or when I was teaching some students, oh, they won't mistreat me. Well, the truth is, like Gus, I just thought if I loved the person and I was kind, they would treat me right. But like Gus, the puppy didn't treat me right all the time, metaphorically. So I tend to trust too much, which goes along with hypo-aroused. I tend to be more hypo-aroused than hyper-aroused. Or are you somebody that is never trusts? It's like, I won't trust him. I'm sure he's cheating on me, or this terrible thing is happening, and you can't move forward in your life because you don't trust enough. And the third thing, like my young self, I didn't believe I was worth it, so my vibration didn't match what I was trying to manifest. So kind of think about things you didn't manifest and how does it sync up? right? So as you sift through all the available information, and next time we'll talk about our attachment system, but I'll give you a clue to it. So again, as a child, I was mistreated by my parents. So I didn't really believe in myself. I didn't feel safe and secure. I was insecure and I was afraid of connection. So I had a crush on Bob Baden, and Bob Baden had a crush on me, and he wanted to ask me to prom. But because I was so afraid of that connection, I sabotaged it. And instead of when he would reach out and want to talk to me, I would be kind of a bitch or would be mean to him. And so he shut down and asked somebody else to the prom. So where, when you look at all the situations, can you see you reacting in a way to sabotage yourself? And then write that down. And as we move forward, we're going to talk about how do you rewire that? And how do you change that once you have that information? But first, you have to be aware of what you're doing to sabotage and what sort of brain reactivity is programmed into your ego and false self and trauma and negative beliefs that prevent you from manifesting. Cool? So I want to talk more about your mind is not your brain. Again, if your mind is vibrating at this beautiful picture of your true essence, it can rewire the brain and body systems. So how to rewire the brain and body systems? For one, again, claim that the cells in your body react to everything that your mind says. So how do you reprogram that? So if the cells in my body are reacting to everything my mind says, and my brain is reactive like a caveman, how does my mind come in, reprogram the brain and body systems to manifest what I want? So we talked about spiritual law 1, just to review. Spiritual law 1 says your sense of self creates your reality. Step 1 is, are you aware if you're in your caveman brain or in your core being essence? Skill 2 is the explorer's mind that comes in and assesses that. So let's move on to this training, spiritual law 2, that says you are not your emotions. They are just energy, and they're not a litmus test for your value. So let's say I sabotage, my high school self sabotages the relationship with Matt, and he breaks up with me after only a week of going steady. I could feel sad and feel abandoned, and that could decide my value. But if I stay step 2, differentiated, individualized, and detached from that energy, that negative emotion, I can then use skill 2. It's a magnetic energy of intention. And again, we'll talk more about this next time, but it's this strong male energy, like two magnets pulling together, that says, I am not my pain. In mindfulness-based psychotherapy, it would be the breath, the distance you have between what your mind says and what's true. And it creates such power that you have some space between the reactivity of your emotions. So you can see emotions as energy and as a brain reactivity, caveman brain reactivity, and not who you are. And then let's go to a summary of this. So in this part 2 of 4, I want to remind you that your mind is not your brain. You are not your negative emotions or reactivity. There is a bigger core being within you. And understand how your brain can help or hurt your manifestations. So you can learn how to use the high vibrational consciousness, HVC mind, the white paint, to rewire your lower vibrational consciousness, reactive brain, the LVC. Does that make sense? I'm so looking forward to part 3, where we take this to the next level. I'm sending you love, kindness, and support along the way.